Well, thank you very much for the very nice welcome. And I basically want to thank Jerry for his introductory comments. Everything was accurate, so don't have any concern. It's just that when somebody goes on at considerable length describing lots of things that you've done and describing all of them in the most favorable possible light, it sets a very high set of expectations. I was introduced once, this was many years ago, at a little college that was just getting into the executive education business. And I was the first speaker on the first morning, as I recall, and this organization had a lot to learn about holding conferences. And so the man in charge asked me if he could take just a little bit of time out of my session to take care of some problems. And so people in the group started saying, look, I got to my room, I didn't have a pillowcase, or the lights weren't bright enough on the desk to read. And this kind of evolved into where are the jogging trails and how can I get vegetarian. This was going on and on. So I tapped on my watch and I guess I sort of flustered the guy. Because he looked at the group, he looked at me, looked at them, and he finally said, listen, these are really important problems you have. We're sorry they happened. We're going to take care of them, but there's a couple things we've got to get out of the way first. And I'd like to introduce you to Joe Badaracco. Now, the advantage of that sort of introduction, and keep this in mind when you get to write your own introductions, is if you're in there with a laundry service and everything, there's almost no way to go but up, okay? It gets expectations set just right. Now, I'm going to do essentially what Jerry described and what Doug asked me to do, which is to talk a little bit about ethics in the current environment. But this will probably surprise many of you. I'm going to say very little about Enron. As I understand the Enron story, if you put aside the colossal scale of the collapse and all of the disruption and harm that it caused to thousands of people, and that's an enormous set of things to put aside, I don't think it's a particularly interesting story. From what I've read in the newspapers, and I've tried to follow this very carefully, and I've gotten lots of inquiries from journalists, the folks at Enron and some folks at Anderson did a lot of things that were wrong. They shouldn't have done them. It was clear what was right and what was wrong. And for the vast majority of people, there's very little value in talking about right and wrong. Most people, fortunately, have a sense of what the difference is between the two. Those who don't, in most cases, it's often hopeless. You've got to keep an eye out on them. If you find them in your organization, you've got to usher them towards the doorway. I'm going to talk about a different kind of problem, different set of problems. And these are the kind of problems which, in the years that I've spent looking at managers who take their responsibilities really seriously, these are the kind of problems that when they recount them for you, you sort of get a sense that their stomach is tightening a little bit, that they're breathing a little faster, that it might be an experience that they learned from, something that they were glad they did once, but in many cases it's something that they don't want to relive again. These problems have a simple name. I call them right versus right problems. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let me start with one, since I've mentioned Enron. Let's talk about the sort of bookend to Enron. If Enron is sort of the biggest and worst of the corporate ethics scandals, let me talk just a little bit about the famous Tylenol episode of the early 1980s. I'm sure you've all heard the standard story. In the fall, I believe it was 1982, 6 people in the Chicago area died of cyanide-laced Tylenol tablets. James Burke, the chairman of the company at the time, has been widely praised as a hero for, in the standard phrase, doing the right thing. Now, Burke is an alumnus of Harvard Business School. We have a case study of the Tylenol episode. He's come back and talked about it. I've had the chance to interview him. And like several of my colleagues, I put kind of a blunt question to him. I said, Mr. Burke, look, what you did resurrecting the brand was phenomenal. You think about a brand that's been implicated in a series of deaths. That was phenomenal. But surely this couldn't have been a difficult issue about doing the right thing. You had to get that product off the shelves. Other people might have died if there was more cyanide. You would have been litigated to death if you left even more of the product out there. You had to remove it. Burke's answer, surprisingly, in private conversations, is that that's largely true. that the decision to pull the product was not a difficult one. But on one occasion, he went on and told me a fascinating story that took place a couple of days before J&J decided to pull the Tylenol. The company had decided it was going to do that. And Burke decided that he ought to come down to Washington, D.C., and talk to two people. One was the head of the Food and Drug Administration, his company's principal regulator. The other was the head of the FBI. He sat down with the two men. They said, look, Mr. Burke, we thought about this a lot. We want you to leave the Tylenol out on the shelves. Burke said, why? Well, the head of the FDA said, we've got Halloween coming up. We don't want copycats to think that they can tamper with a product and basically be the tail that wags the dog of a big company. And the head of the FBI, William Webster, said, we don't know whether this is terrorism or not, but the U.S. policy is we don't accede to terrorists, so could you please leave the product on the shelf? Burke still says that at that moment, he does not know what he would have done. As a corporate officer, as a human being, he wanted the product off the shelves. As a citizen, he was being asked by the man who was responsible for the safety of foods and drugs and by the chief law enforcement officer in the United States to leave it out there. This was an unambiguous conflict between right and right. And what Burke says is interesting. He says, I got lucky. There was a knock on the door. Someone handed William Webster a note. Webster read it. He talked with his counterpart. They said, Mr. Burke, you can pull the Tylenol. The note said that there had been another poisoning. This one in California, not Chicago, strychnine, not cyanide. They concluded that it wasn't terrorism, that if there was copycatting, it was already underway, that it was better to get the product off in case any more of it was contaminated. But the key statement is Burke's, that to this day, he still doesn't know what he would have done. Now that's a grand, once in a career, sort of right versus right problem. There's some that happen every couple of months, and I bet many of you have counterparts to the story I'm about to tell you. You're at home one night. I'll dress the story up a little bit. There's a knock on the door. You open it up. It's somebody you've worked with, lives a couple towns away. He actually works for you. He comes in and says, look, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to talk to you for a couple of minutes. Sure, come on in. Have a drink. And what this guy says to you is he has found the house of his dreams. And he tells you that this is what he and his wife have been looking for, and they had to take a little money out of the kid's college fund, and it's going to be a really big mortgage. But, you know, since you're the best boss he's ever had, and a good friend, and possibly even the best boss he could even conceive of having, he just wanted you to be the first to know. But you know that there are layoffs coming at the company. And you know that this individual's name is on the list. Now, I dressed this story up a little bit, but in the last 10 years, I've been told 4 different versions of this exact same story. What's the basic issue here? Well, you're supposed to do the right thing, right? What's the right thing? Well, as a corporate officer, you have a duty of confidentiality. And under that duty, you are not supposed to disclose the layoff until all the ducks are lined up with HR and with legal, until it makes the most sense for the company to make the announcement. And I'm sure everybody in here can understand why. As a friend, you owe a debt to this person. And if he's just about to jump off a financial precipice, wouldn't a friend reach out and pull back? And by the way, maybe this individual's actually heard something through the grapevine and is kind of implicitly asking you, what's really going on? Should I go ahead with this? And if somebody asks you a question, you're supposed to tell them the truth. So again, this is not right versus wrong. This is right versus right versus right. And then there are the everyday examples. The soccer game, the budget, the relative that you ought to visit in the hospital. That's not right and wrong. That's right versus right.